Hi everybody, my name is Jessica Capron and this is my Teach Pack video discussion for chapters 9, 12, 13, 14, and 15 of week 2. My PowerPoint was not working, so I had to download this as a PDF, so I apologize if this looks a little wonky as I scroll, but I wanted to touch upon a few things that I found from each chapter of importance. So within chapter 9, this chapter is foundational. It's imperative. Quality prenatal care, which is described in this chapter is absolutely essential. Um, this chapter describes behavioral genetics, which is essentially nature versus nurture. It's the interplay between genetics and the environment. Genetics has much of an impact on a person's potentials, as does their environment. There are 3 stages or periods in the prenatal development stage: the germinal, embryonic, and fetal stage. And within these stages, it ranges between implantation to mitosis, to the 3rd week, where the implantation on the multicellular organism is formed, called the embryo. Placenta is formed during the 3rd week, and the placenta is important because it provides all the nutrients and oxygen from the embryo from the mother. I can dive a little deeper into these periods, but for the sake of time, we're going to go straight to the teratogens, which I think are most important to address in this chapter. Teratogens are environmental factors that can contribute to birth defects and include some maternal diseases, pollutants, drugs, and alcohol. What is most important about this chapter is to recognize that quality prenatal care is essential. Teratogens are factors that play into prenatal risk, and some of those factors include the timing of exposure, the amount of exposure, the number of teratogens that the mother has, genetics, being male or female, alcohol, tobacco, prescriptions or over-the-counter drugs, illicit drugs, and pollutants. All of these factors play into prenatal risk, and it's important to recognize what those factors are. Moving on to chapter 12, the psychosocial development in infancy and childhood. For me, the most important aspect of this chapter was the differentiation between temperament and personality. Temperament is the innate characteristic of the infant, including their mood, activity level, and emotional reactivity, which is noticeable after birth. And the personality is the individual's consistent pattern of feeling, thinking, and behaving, and is the result of um, their the interplay between biological and disposition and their experience. So temperament is something that does not change dramatically over the course of the child's growth, but you learn to work around and manage those temperamental qualities. Personality can include temperament, but it can also be made up of other features like self-concept, values, goals, your motivations to achieve and socialize, sense of responsibility. So these qualities are influenced by biological dispositions, but also by the child's experience with others, especially in close relationships. It is important to have close and positive relationships, as those guide the growth of the individual's characteristics. There are various stages of infant emotion that I found interesting. At birth, attraction and withdrawal are the first two emotions. And as the child grows, at 2 months, they begin to smile, which is a social way of engagement. At 3 to 5 months of age, they begin to laugh and express pleasure, especially to their caregivers. Between the ages of 6 and 8, there is an element or a recognition of fear and social anxiety or separation anxiety, rather. The child is dependent upon their caregiver, and when the caregiver is not present, that can emphasize the separation anxiety between that child and their caregiver, especially because between the ages of 6 and 15 months, object permanence has been acquired. And then the final emotion is self-regulation. And as we know, self-regulation is an emotion that is worked through even through adulthood, but it is on the caregiver and it requires the assistance of the caregiver to facilitate positive and impactful coping skills. Moving on to chapter 13, physical development in early childhood. I thought it was interesting that by age 6, the brain is 95% of the of its adult weight. So during this stage, the brain is growing at it seems to be a very rapid rate. The prefrontal cortex is being grown and is expanding, which is the area of the brain behind the forehead. It helps us think. It helps us regulate our emotions. It helps us control our attention, and it helps us control our emotional outbursts and our understanding of the world around us. Additionally, the left and right hemisphere are being formed and are dramatically increasing in size. The left hemisphere is responsible for language skills, and the right hemisphere is responsible for things like recognizing shapes and patterns. During this stage, children are improving their gross and fine motor skills. Their gross motor skills include running and jumping and being able to use their bodies in a way that's a little bit more fine-tuned than when they were younger. And their fine motor skills could include something like pouring water into a glass or coloring. So all those motor skills are becoming more precise and more refined during this stage. Another interesting fact is that 98% of children are toilet trained by 36 months, and that it is not necessarily so important to hone in on the age of the child when it comes to potty training, but by their physical and emotional readiness to be potty trained. You don't want to push too quickly or too urgently or too quickly, too young. If a child expresses interest and then suddenly pulls back, it might be time to just pause potty training. So you want to focus on that individual child's individual readiness to be potty trained. Moving on to chapter 14, cognitive development in early childhood. This is where children learn about the basic principles about how the world works. And I believe his name is pronounced Piaget, his pre-operational stages. In these stages, children begin to use symbols to represent words, images, and ideas. This is where pretend play comes into existence in the child's play structure. So children begin to use language, do begin to use language, but they may not understand what adult logic is, or be able to mentally manipulate information the same way that someone who's older can. Um, their logic is based on their own experience of the world so far, rather than, again, knowledge that others might have. And there are two stages of the pre-operational stage. It's the symbolic function substage and the intuitive thought substage. The symbolic function substage occurs between 2 and 4 years old, and this is when a child is able to mentally represent an object that is not present. And the intuitive thought substage, which lasts from 4 to 7 years old, is when a child is able to depend on more intuitive thinking rather than perception. So a lot of questions are being asked during this stage. Vygotsky's sociocultural theory of cognitive development is also important to recognize. He understands Piaget's perspective and includes it in his theory, but he emphasizes the importance of language, writings, and the concepts arising from that child's individual culture as imperative for cognitive development. Lastly, we have chapter 15, the psychosocial development in early childhood. This is when a child begins to develop a desire to take initiative and think of different ideas to provide initiative action. The child begins to start having a little bit more self-control. This is something that takes years to fully develop, but because their executive function is developing, they are able to become less impulsive and to exhibit more self-control. Additionally, children are very interested in gender. This is when they begin questioning and becoming curious about the differences between boys and girls. Um, and this is also where some theories about gender come into play, where, in the social learning theory, it argues that behavior is learned through observation and modeling and reinforcement. So children are rewarded and punished based on what is the perceived gender roles of society and what's being taught to them. Children learn their gender roles from from modeling of the adults and older children around them. And in the developmental intergroup theory, it states that gender is so strong because society places a strong emphasis on gender. So, children who are always questioning the world around them and looking up to their caregivers and to older children around them, they pay attention to gender because society pays attention to gender and places such an emphasis on it. And it provides a key source of information about children, about themselves, about others. So they seek out any possible gender differences. Something important to note is that approximately 0.3% of the US population identifies as transgender, and that findings indicate that gender development of these socially transitioned children is similar to gender development of cisgender children or those whose gender and sex assigned at birth match. I thought that was an interesting statistic. For the sake of not running out of time, I'm going to briefly talk about ACEs, which are types of abuse, neglect, and other traumatic experiences before the age of 18. The more ACEs, the more negative effects it can have on a child. It's linked to risky behavior, chronic health conditions. So the more ACEs a child has, the higher likelihood of risks that they will develop and that will come into play into their life. That was a very brief description of ACEs, but thank you all for listening, and I will see everyone in class.